It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done.
That's why I'm more interested not in how the Egyptians built the pyramids, but how the pyramids helped to build Egypt.
In the Great Pyramid, the granite comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof, the ceiling of the King's Chamber, are all made with gigantic granite blocks. Grok AI just identified the exact method the ancient Egyptians used to cut granite. And when scientists saw the results, they had no explanation. Not, "We need more data." Not, "This requires further study." No explanation. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Because what Grok found inside Egypt's Aswan quarries shouldn't exist. Not in the Bronze Age, not with the tools history says they had, not at the precision level carved into rock harder than steel. The marks are too perfect, the geometry is too consistent, and the method Grok classified as the closest match is one humanity didn't develop until the 20th century. So the question isn't whether the ancient Egyptians cut this granite. They did. The question, the one scientists are now refusing to answer directly, is how. The secret carved into stone. In the deep heat of southern Egypt, where the Nile bends through sandstone hills and acacia trees cast thin shadows over cracked desert ground, there is a place that has been quietly defying explanation for centuries. The Aswan granite quarries. From a distance it looks like any ancient industrial site. Scattered boulders, abandoned fragments, the stillness of a place that once shook with human labor. But walk into the quarry, crouch beside an exposed rock face, and something starts to feel wrong before you can name it. Cut into solid granite, not sandstone, not limestone, but granite, rated 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than steel, are smooth, curved scoop marks, long, flowing arcs, precise, uniform, nested into each other like waves frozen mid-motion. Not random, not rough, not human. Here's the story mainstream archaeology has been telling for over a century. Ancient Egyptian workers shaped this granite using diorite stones, dense, ball-shaped hammers, armies of laborers swinging them for hours, days, years, pounding the hardest rock in the ancient world into submission through brute force and patience. It's a compelling story. It holds together on paper. Here's what happened when researchers actually tested it. They gathered diorite stones, skilled craftsmen, controlled conditions, and struck granite the way the textbooks prescribe, thousands of times. The marks they produced were rough, uneven, chaotic, scattered pits of inconsistent depth, with no uniform curvature and no mathematical regularity. They look like the product of human effort under difficult conditions. The Aswan quarry marks look like the product of a machine. That gap between what the diorite theory predicts and what the stone actually shows has been sitting in the archaeological record for decades. Known, noted, quietly set aside. Then Grok AI looked at it, and that's when things got deeply strange. What the machine found that researchers couldn't ignore. Nobody anticipated what happened when Grok processed the data. Researchers fed high-resolution photogrammetric scans of the Aswan quarry surfaces into Grok AI's analytical framework. The system developed by XAI, capable of cross-referencing geometric signatures against thousands of known tool profiles, both ancient and modern. Grok didn't simply describe the marks. It measured them. Every arc radius, every entry angle, every depth, every spacing interval across 847 individual cuts. The variance in cut size came back at 4.3%. To understand what that number means, consider this. When a skilled human craftsman performs a repetitive cutting motion, even with a precision modern hand tool, variance in output typically runs between 12 and 22%. The human body is not a machine. Fatigue sets in. The angle drifts. The depth shifts. The spacing becomes irregular. That's not failure, that's biology. 4.3% is not biology. 4.3% is a controlled industrial process. But Grok returned a second metric that hit even harder. The entry angle of the tool into the granite surface, repeated across hundreds of cuts, made at different locations, different orientations, and different depths across the entire quarry, varied by less than 2 degrees. 2 degrees across an ancient industrial complex the size of a city block. When Grok ran its closest match classification against its modern tool database, it returned 3 analogs: diamond-tipped rotary cutting systems, water jet cutting equipment operating at tens of thousands of pounds per square inch, ultrasonic cutting tools that vibrate a blade at frequencies beyond human perception. None of those technologies existed before the 20th century. Grok flagged the result with 94% confidence. The Aswan quarry marks were produced by a mechanically guided, rotationally consistent cutting process. Not hammers, not diorite, a process. And the signature that process left behind in the stone is so geometrically precise, so mechanically uniform across hundreds of individual cuts, that an AI trained on the full spectrum of human tool signatures, ancient and modern, could find no Bronze Age match for it anywhere in its database. If you want to understand why ancient Egypt keeps breaking every model we apply to it, subscribe now. The next few minutes are going to change how you see this civilization. The places where no human body could have made these marks. Here's where it gets strange in a different way. The marks appear everywhere in the Aswan quarry: horizontal surfaces, angled faces, vertical walls, the sides of partially extracted blocks. But spend enough time looking, and some of those cuts are in locations where no human being could have stood to make them. Tight interior corners, where 2 granite faces meet at angles so acute that not even a child's fist could swing a diorite hammer with any meaningful force. Vertical surfaces buried beneath blocks that were never fully removed, sealed off from above while the work was apparently still in progress. The marks are there on those sealed surfaces too, identical in geometry to everything else. And then there are the shafts. Across the quarry complex, researchers have documented deep, narrow pits plunging 30 to 50 feet below the current surface, some no more than 3 to 4 feet wide at the mouth. Their walls are smooth, marked with the same curved arcing patterns found on the open surfaces above. Think carefully about what it would take to produce those marks by hand. You lower a worker into a pit barely wide enough to turn around in. Granite on all 4 sides, no room for a full swing, no meaningful leverage, near total darkness. Choking granite dust with nowhere to go, 30 to 40 feet of vertical depth below the surface. And somehow, at the bottom of that shaft, the marks on the walls are geometrically identical to the marks made in the open air above, where a worker had full range of motion and all the space they needed. A diorite hammer requires a minimum swing arc of roughly 18 to 24 inches to generate enough impact velocity to cut granite at any meaningful rate. The interior diameter of these shafts doesn't accommodate that arc at lower depths. It isn't marginally too small. It is physically incompatible with the tool the standard explanation requires. Grok's conclusion, when it processed the shaft data, was definitive. The AI ran the spatial constraints, shaft dimensions, force required to produce the observed surface texture at granite's Mohs 7 hardness, and the physical angles of the cut marks relative to available working clearance at multiple depth intervals, and returned a spatial impossibility classification. The marks in those confined spaces cannot have been produced by any percussive hand tool. The geometry doesn't permit it. The physics doesn't support it. Whatever made those marks operated in confined spaces, without needing human range of motion, maintained consistent cutting characteristics regardless of orientation, and applied force perpendicular to the stone surface without depending on a swinging arm behind it. That is not a Bronze Age tool description. That's a powered instrument. But the spatial impossibility is actually the second most disturbing finding. Grok returned because when it went microscopic, the evidence got worse. The microscope sees something that shouldn't be. There. Hammering granite leaves an unmistakable microscopic signature. The crystals in the stone fracture along cleavage planes. The surface is rough at the grain scale, full of angular breaks and stress fractures extending below the visible surface into a subsurface damage zone several millimeters deep. The material is destroyed grain by grain. Under a microscope, percussive granite work looks like a battlefield. Angular, violent, chaotic at the mineral scale. The Aswan marks don't look like that at all. Under high magnification, the cut surfaces show what researchers describe as controlled material removal. The crystal structures at the surface are sheared, not fractured. The individual mineral grains at the cut boundary show clean separation, sliced, not broken. The transition from cut surface to uncut granite is sharp and defined. A clean boundary with no subsurface damage zone radiating inward. It looks less like the aftermath of percussion and more like the surface produced when a precision rotary tool passes across a material at calibrated speed with fixed geometry. And it gets stranger still. Tiny spiral patterns are visible at high magnification on the cut faces, patterns consistent with the surface trace, left by a rapidly rotating tool moving across granite in a controlled arc. These are not random scratches. They are directional, consistent in their handedness, rotating the same way across multiple cut surfaces examined in different sections of the quarry. That consistency implies a tool with a fixed rotational direction, a powered tool. Nothing in the hand tool inventory produces a consistent rotational spiral trace. Then there is the thermal evidence. Localized zones of thermal alteration are present on the cut surfaces, microscopic regions where the granite shows evidence of heat exposure that couldn't have come from simple stone-on-stone friction. When two pieces of granite are rubbed together, even at speed, the friction heat distributes broadly across a wide contact area. The thermal signatures in the Aswan cuts are localized and point source consistent, matching a small, rapidly rotating contact area like a rotary tooltip rather than a broad sliding surface. The temperature signature suggests conditions far exceeding what diorite on granite percussion generates under any experimental conditions researchers have been able to replicate. And then there are the trace material inclusions. In several areas of the cut surface, researchers have identified microscopic particles of corundum, crystalline aluminum oxide, rated 9 on the Mohs scale, harder than granite itself, the same material used in modern industrial abrasive wheels, embedded in the cut faces. Possibly, they also identified diamond carbon structures, the kind of abrasive materials that modern precision cutting depends on entirely, found in surfaces supposedly carved 3,000 years before industrial chemistry existed. Grok processed the full microscopic data set, the spiral patterns, the thermal signatures, the subsurface boundary characteristics, and the anomalous trace materials, and returned a process classification at 94% confidence. Industrial-grade rotary cutting with diamond composite abrasive tips, not bronze, not diorite, diamond composite, in an ancient quarry. Dr. Parkhak, reviewing Grok's microscopic classification output, reportedly stood up from her chair. She had spent 20 years analyzing remote sensing data of archaeological sites. She had seen many things that complicated the standard timeline. "This," she said to a colleague, "is the one that doesn't have an exit." The timeline runs backward. Here is the finding that rewrites everything, and it needs to land clearly, because everything that follows depends on it. The quarry marks are not all the same age. At several locations in the Aswan complex, ancient Egyptian red ochre paintings have been found sitting directly on top of the scoop marks. Radiometric dating and paleographic analysis of those paintings places them at a minimum of 2,000 years before the earliest dynastic Egyptian civilization. Some estimates push further, which means the marks beneath the paintings are older still, pre-dynastic, pre-pharaonic. From a period when, according to mainstream archaeology, Egypt was home to tribal cultures with stone tools and no centralized engineering tradition capable of producing anything close to what Aswan shows. And here's what nobody expected. Those are the most precise marks in the entire quarry. Grok's temporal precision analysis, correlating cut geometry against estimated surface age across the full Aswan dataset, returned a finding at 91% confidence. Cut precision correlates negatively with age. The older the cut, the higher the geometric consistency. The newer the cut, the more variable, the rougher, the more human. Technology is supposed to improve over time. The earliest work should be the roughest, the most recent, the most refined. That's the story of every human civilization we've ever studied. Tools get better, techniques accumulate, knowledge compounds. At Aswan, it runs backward. The later quarry marks, clearly associated with known dynastic Egyptian activity and post-dating the ochre paintings, are rougher, less controlled, and more consistent with what conventional Bronze Age tools actually produce. The earlier marks are geometrically flawless. Grok flagged this inversion as statistically significant at the 99th percentile. Not a sampling artifact, not observational bias. A genuine, consistent, reproducible pattern running through the data across hundreds of cuts at multiple locations across the quarry complex. What does that mean? It means one of exactly two things, and neither fits comfortably inside the world archaeology has built. Either a pre-Egyptian civilization, predating dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, possessed cutting technology more advanced than anything the Egyptians themselves could produce. A civilization that worked these quarries, shaped this stone with a process still unclassifiable within any known historical tool inventory, and then disappeared before the first pharaoh ever ruled, leaving nothing behind but marks too precise to explain and too old to assign. Or the technology existed at the very dawn of Egyptian civilization and was subsequently lost, not superseded by better methods, simply gone, allowed to vanish without a trace, leaving later workers to produce inferior results with inferior tools on stone someone else had already shaped with impossible precision. In either case, something was here. It worked. And then it didn't anymore. The knowledge written into the stone's own bones. But there is a layer beneath all of this that Grok's analysis surfaced, and it may be the most unsettling detail of everything. Granite isn't homogeneous. Beneath its surface lies a complex internal architecture, veins of differing mineral composition, zones of relative hardness and weakness, and planes where the crystal lattice is more likely to fracture under stress. Mapping those internal structures accurately is genuinely difficult, even with modern equipment, ground-penetrating technology, careful geological surveys, and skilled interpretation. It takes time and sophisticated tools to read what's happening inside a granite mass. The ancient cuts at Aswan follow those internal veins with uncanny precision. The curved marks don't just remove material, they track along grain boundaries, navigate around harder mineral inclusions, and exploit natural planes of weakness in the stone's internal structure in ways that minimize force requirements and maximize material removal efficiency. In engineering terms, they are optimal, not approximately optimal, genuinely, measurably optimal. Modern quarrying operations try to achieve this with sonar scanning and geological modeling. Modern engineers attempt to work with the stone's grain structure rather than against it. They succeed, partially and inconsistently. The ancient cuts at Aswan achieve it more consistently than modern operations typically manage. Grok's correlation analysis, mapping cut geometry against estimated subsurface mineral structure using surface mineralogy as a proxy for internal grain architecture, returned a statistically significant alignment at 88% confidence between where the cuts were placed and where the stone's internal weak points would be expected to lie. Whoever made those marks wasn't just cutting granite. They were reading it, understanding its internal three-dimensional structure before ever touching it, targeting the precise locations where the stone would yield most efficiently to whatever tool they were using. Either that represents geological knowledge developed over an extraordinarily long period of working this specific quarry, knowledge never recorded and simply vanishing with whoever held it. Or it represents some form of subsurface detection capability with no equivalent anywhere in the Bronze Age archaeological record. They knew where to cut before they cut. They cut there precisely every time, across hundreds of individual operations spanning a quarry the size of a city block. And then they stopped, left no manual, no schematic, no record of how they knew. Just the marks, optimal, precisely placed, following the stone's own hidden architecture, like someone reading a blueprint no one else could see. They're gone, and the knowledge went with them. The unfinished obelisk and the abandoned method. Not far from the quarry floor lies the most famous artifact the Aswan complex has produced, the unfinished obelisk still attached to the bedrock where it was abandoned thousands of years ago, representing more than 1,000 tons of granite, partially shaped and simply left. Workers apparently vanished mid-project and never returned. The standard explanation that a crack in the stone caused abandonment doesn't fully hold. Cutting marks continue past the crack. Work apparently proceeded after the fracture appeared. Whatever ended the project, it wasn't the crack alone. Something else stopped it, and that something left no record. But look at the marks on the obelisk surface. They are the same curved patterns found throughout the quarry. Identical geometry, identical variants, and at the base of the obelisk, where cutting would have been most confined and workers would have been operating in the tightest available space, the marks are no different from the ones made in open air. The precision doesn't drop when the space gets smaller. That is exactly what you expect from a powered instrument, and exactly what you don't expect from a handheld percussive tool that depends on human swing mechanics. Confined space should degrade the output. Here, it doesn't, not even slightly. The obelisk was meant to be the largest ever quarried in ancient Egypt. Someone started it confident enough in their tools and their process to commit to a project of that scale, investing enormous time and resources on the assumption that the method was reliable. Something stopped them before completion. They never came back. What they had was real. It functioned. It produced results so consistent, so geometrically exact, so mechanically repeatable, that an AI with access to the full range of human tool signatures, ancient and modern, would look at the output 4,000 years later and classify it as industrial machinery. Whatever it was, it worked. And then, it didn't. And we have no explanation for where it went. Grok's comparative analysis, cross-referencing the Aswan findings against granite working sites at the Giza Pyramid Complex, the Valley Temple of Khafre, and multiple locations in the Nile Delta, returned consistent parallels. The same precision signature, the same negative age-to-precision correlation, the same mismatch between proposed tools and observed results. At the Valley Temple of Khafre, The massive granite casing structure at the base of the second pyramid, widely acknowledged as among the oldest surviving Egyptian monuments, the interior wall surfaces show the same anomalous cut characteristics Grok identified at Aswan. The same entry angle consistency, the same sub-5% variance, the same clean shear boundary at the microscopic level rather than the subsurface damage zone that diorite percussion leaves behind. The Valley Temple is believed to predate the Old Kingdom, possibly by a significant margin. Grok's cross-site confidence on this correlation came back at 89%. This was not confined to one quarry or one period. It was applied across a geography, consistently and repeatedly, by whatever process, civilization, or knowledge system produced it. A tradition or infrastructure that spanned sites survived long enough to leave its signature across multiple monumental construction projects, and then ended, leaving only the marks behind to prove it had ever existed. Where does that leave us? The honest answer is this: we don't know. And that is not a comfortable thing to say about a site that professional archaeologists have studied for more than 150 years. Not a fringe site, not a disputed ruin, a quarry that has been walked, mapped, photographed, and debated by serious, credentialed researchers for generations. And still, the marks resist every explanation the field has been willing to offer. What Grok produced is not a theory. It's not a fringe claim on an anonymous forum. It's a measurement result produced by a system given raw geometric data and asked to classify what it saw against every tool signature in its database, ancient and modern, primitive and industrial, without being told what answer was expected. The marks show 4.3% variance across 847 cuts. The entry angle consistency is within 2 degrees across an entire industrial complex. The closest modern process match is industrial rotary cutting with diamond composite abrasive tips, classified at 94% confidence. The temporal correlation, the oldest cuts most precise, the newest most crude, is negative at the 99th percentile of statistical significance. That is the data. Full stop. Scientists cannot explain it. Not because they haven't tried, but because every conventional explanation fails when actually tested against the numbers Grok returned. The diorite hammer theory, run against the 4.3% variance figure, produces results that differ from the observed data by a factor of 3 to 5. The spatial analysis of the shaft marks rules out percussive tools on physics grounds, not opinion grounds. The microscopic shear signature, clean boundary, no subsurface damage zone, and spiral rotation traces match powered rotary cutting, and match nothing in the Bronze Age toolkit. And here's what nobody in mainstream Egyptology wants to sit with. The temporal inversion has been known in some form for decades. It wasn't secret. It wasn't buried in obscure journals. Researchers who spent real time at Aswan noticed that the oldest-looking marks seemed cleaner, more uniform, and harder to explain. They noticed. They moved on, because there was no framework available to quantify what they were seeing, and no institutional appetite for where quantifying it would lead. Grok provided the framework, and the framework returned answers the institutions are not going to find comfortable. There is a gap between what the diorite hammer theory predicts and what the stone actually shows. That gap has been quietly acknowledged and professionally set aside for a century and a half. What Grok did was measure it precisely, reproducibly, without the weight of archaeological consensus pressing on every conclusion. The gap is real. It is wider and more precisely documented than it has ever been before. And it doesn't live in a report. It doesn't live in a database. It sits in the stone at Aswan, Smooth under your hand if you go there, warm from the desert sun, older than the civilization we attribute it to, waiting for an explanation that fits the numbers. We don't have one yet, and the people who should be providing it are still largely looking the other way. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the oldest cuts in a quarry are the most precise and the newest are the crudest, what does that tell you about the civilization that made the oldest ones? And why does every institution with a stake in the current historical timeline seem so reluctant to ask it out loud? Leave your answer below. Subscribe if you want to go deeper, because the next video takes this further than anyone has gone publicly. And the evidence there is even harder to explain away. The stone is still there, the marks are still there, and the number Grok returned, 4.3%, is still impossible.